The sun hung low over the quiet streets of Springfield, Ohio, casting a golden glow across the neighborhood. It was one of those rare evenings when the world seemed to slow down, taking a breath before the busy pace of tomorrow. 8-year-old Sophie sat cross-legged on her front porch, absently swinging her legs back and forth. Her worn notebook rested in her lap, its pages filled with sketches of everything from birds to flowers to her favorite moments at school. Drawing had always been a way for Sophie to escape into her imagination, but today, her mind felt unsettled. The week had been long. Her teacher, Mrs. Allen, had been drilling into them the importance of kindness. Even the smallest gestures can make a difference, she often said. Sophie couldn't help but feel like she had yet to do something that truly mattered. She wanted to make a difference, to do something that would make her feel like she was helping the world in her own small way. Her parents, Jenna and Mark, were busy inside the house, cleaning up after dinner. "Sophie, don't forget to pack your lunch for tomorrow," Jenna called from the kitchen, breaking Sophie from her thoughts. Sophie nodded and hopped up from the porch, heading inside. Her little yellow lunchbox was sitting on the counter, and she took her time packing it. A peanut butter and jelly sandwich, an apple, and a small pack of cookies, all the essentials. Her mom always made sure to pack her lunch with love. But today Sophie felt like maybe, just maybe, she could do something more. The next morning, Sophie's walk to school was like any other. She hummed softly to herself, clutching her lunchbox in one hand and her notebook in the other. The neighborhood was peaceful, and the air was crisp as she made her way toward the school. As she passed the park near her school, something caught her eye. Sitting on a bench was a man, his clothes ragged and his hair unkempt. He looked tired, exhausted, even. His face carried the weight of many long days spent alone. Sophie had seen him before, sitting there, but today something about him seemed different. There was a sadness in his posture, an overwhelming sense of weariness that made her pause. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, but as other children walked past, oblivious, Sophie couldn't help but feel a tug at her heart. She wanted to help him, but what could she do? She continued walking, pushing the thought aside, but it clung to her like a shadow. Throughout the day, Sophie found it hard to concentrate. Her teacher's voice was a distant hum in the background as Sophie's thoughts kept drifting back to the man on the bench. At lunchtime, she sat quietly at the cafeteria table, staring at her lunchbox, still unopened. Her friends around her chatted and giggled, but Sophie felt distant, lost in her thoughts. She opened the lunchbox and looked at the sandwich inside. Her mom had even cut it into triangles, just the way she liked. But somehow, Sophie wasn't hungry. "I'm not that hungry," she mumbled to herself, closing the lid of the lunchbox. When the lunch bell rang, she didn't rush to the playground like the others. Instead, she grabbed her lunchbox and headed straight to the park. Her feet crunched softly on the gravel path as she made her way toward the bench. The man was still there, his hands clasped together, staring into the distance. He didn't notice her approach at first, but when she said softly, "Hi," he turned to look at her. "Hi there," he replied, his voice deep but gentle. Sophie didn't say much more, but simply pulled the lunchbox from her bag and handed it to him. "I thought you might like this," Sophie said simply, her voice calm, but her heart racing. The man looked at her for a long moment, clearly taken aback by her gesture. "For me?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Sophie nodded, her small face breaking into a quiet smile. "Yeah, my mom always packs too much anyway," she said, feeling a warmth in her chest. The man's hands trembled as he took the lunchbox, a faint smile forming on his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. Sophie felt a swell of happiness as she turned to leave. She waved goodbye to the man and skipped back toward school, feeling a sense of joy she couldn't quite explain. She had done something small, but it felt significant. She didn't know it yet, but that simple act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. The next morning, things felt like they were returning to normal. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen as Sophie's father, Mark, read the newspaper at the table. Her mother, Jenna, hummed while flipping pancakes, and Sophie sat nearby, doodling in her notebook. Everything felt peaceful routine, until there came a sharp knock at the door. It was early, too early for a visitor, and certainly too early for anything to be wrong. Mark looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. Who could that be? He muttered under his breath. Jenna, equally confused, exchanged a glance with him. Sophie peeked around the corner, her curiosity piqued. Mark stood and walked to the door, opening it to reveal two police officers standing on the porch. Their expressions were serious, but not threatening. "Good morning," one of them said. His voice was professional, but there was something in his tone that made the air seem thicker with tension. "Are you Mr. and Mrs. Parker?" the second officer asked, glancing inside. Mark answered cautiously. "Yes, that's us. Is there a problem?" "We're here about your daughter, Sophie," the first officer said, his gaze turning toward the small girl standing in the doorway. Sophie froze, her heart pounding. She exchanged a quick, nervous look with her mother. "Ma'am, we just need to ask her a few questions," the second officer continued. "About an interaction she had yesterday." Sophie's stomach sank, and she could feel her mother's worry grow. "Interaction with who?" Jenna asked, her voice rising slightly with concern. The officers exchanged a brief glance before the first officer responded. "There's a man, a homeless veteran we've been searching for. We believe your daughter may have spoken to him yesterday at the park." Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she exchanged a look with her mom. She had no idea what this was all about. "We were patrolling last night," the officer explained, "and one of our units saw a man with a yellow lunchbox. Your daughter's name was on it, and he identified her as the one who gave it to him." Sophie's voice barely broke through the tension in the air. "Is he okay?" she asked. The officers softened at her question. "He's safe, thanks to you," one of them said gently, "but we need to understand more about what happened." Sophie couldn't have known that her small act of kindness would lead to such an unexpected and life-altering turn of events. But what the officers were about to reveal would change everything. The officers were invited inside the Parker home, their presence filling the cozy living room with an air of tension. Sophie sat perched on the edge of the couch, clutching her notebook tightly to her chest, while her parents, Mark and Jenna, sat on either side of her, their faces filled with concern and confusion. The officers took a seat across from them, their gazes fixed on Sophie as they prepared to explain the situation. The first officer began, his tone steady but filled with gravity. "The man your daughter helped is named Samuel Grayson. He's a veteran who served overseas for several years." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "About 2 months ago, Samuel went missing from a nearby VA hospital. Since then, he's been living on the streets, struggling with severe memory loss and disorientation." Sophie tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowed in curiosity. "He didn't seem scary," she said softly. "He just seemed sad." The officer smiled gently, his eyes filled with understanding. "That's right, Sophie. He's not dangerous. In fact, what you did for him has helped us find him." Jenna's hand instinctively rested on Sophie's shoulder. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. The second officer nodded, continuing the explanation. "When we found Samuel, he was carrying the lunchbox with your daughter's name on it. He told us that the lunchbox reminded him of someone, his daughter." Sophie's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't realized that her small act of kindness had somehow connected her to this man's past. The officer continued, "After doing some research, we discovered that Samuel has a family, a wife and a daughter, who live in Cincinnati. They've been searching for him since he disappeared." Jenna gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "He has a family," she whispered, stunned by the revelation. The officer nodded. "Yes. Your daughter's gesture, her kindness, helped us make the connection we needed to reunite him with his family. If it weren't for Sophie, we wouldn't have been able to piece this together." Mark leaned forward, his voice low and filled with emotion. "How does a man like that, someone who served his country, end up forgotten like this? How does someone slip through the cracks?" The officer sighed, a weary look crossing his face. "It happens more often than you might think, sir. But in this case, thanks to Sophie, there's hope. We've managed to track down his family, and they'll be able to get him the help he needs." Sophie sat quietly, processing everything she had just heard. She hadn't known that her small act would lead to something so significant. All she had done was give the man her lunch, something she did without thinking much of it. But now, she understood that her kindness had played a crucial role in bringing Samuel back to his family. "Thank you, Sophie," the first officer said warmly, looking directly at her. "You've done something very special, something that most people wouldn't even think to do. You gave this man a reason to believe that there's good in the world." Sophie's cheeks flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. She had never expected any of this. To her, it had just been a simple gesture, a sandwich given to someone who seemed like he needed it. But now, in the face of the officer's gratitude, Sophie realized that sometimes even the smallest actions could have a ripple effect far greater than she could ever have imagined. As the officers prepared to leave, one of them turned to Jenna and Mark. "There's one more thing we should mention. Not everyone in the neighborhood may see Sophie's actions in the same light. While we know the importance of what she did, some people might not understand. Be prepared for some unexpected reactions." Jenna nodded, a wave of uncertainty sweeping over her. "Thank you for letting us know. We'll be ready." The officers left, their visit leaving behind an air of quiet reflection. As the door closed behind them, the Parker family sat in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. For Sophie, it was a moment of realization. What had seemed like a simple, unimportant act had turned into something life-changing, not just for Samuel, but for his family and for her as well. Later that day, the peace of the neighborhood was shattered by the murmurs of gossip and speculation. Word spread quickly about Sophie's encounter with the homeless veteran. By the time the sun was setting, a crowd had gathered on the Parkers' front lawn, their voices a mixture of curiosity, concern, and skepticism. Sophie watched from the window, her stomach tightening at the sight of so many people standing in front of her house, talking in hushed tones. She couldn't understand why something so small, helping a man with lunch, had stirred up so much attention. She didn't feel like she had done anything special. Her mother, Jenna, stepped outside, her calm demeanor trying to diffuse the rising tension. "Is there something we can help you with?" she asked, her voice firm yet polite. Mrs. Braddock, the elderly neighbor from across the street, spoke first. "We heard about the man your daughter helped. Is it true he's homeless? A veteran?" Her tone was inquisitive, but there was a certain unease behind it. Jenna nodded, taking a deep breath before answering. "Yes, it's true. He's a homeless veteran, but he's been reunited with his family, thanks to Sophie." Another neighbor chimed in, crossing his arms. "But what if he comes back? What if he's dangerous?" His voice was tinged with suspicion, and several others in the crowd murmured in agreement. Mark stepped outside, standing next to his wife, his voice steady but firm. "He's not dangerous. He's a man who needed help, and our daughter showed him kindness. That's all." The tension in the air was palpable, and Sophie could feel her heart race as she watched the crowd. She didn't understand why people were making such a big deal out of what she had done. She just wanted to help someone who needed it. The murmurs of doubt seemed to quiet for a moment as Mr. Hernandez, the local grocery store owner, stepped forward. "That little girl did what most of us wouldn't have done. Maybe we should think about that before we judge," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. There were a few nods of agreement, but the crowd remained uncertain. Sophie stayed inside, listening to her parents defend her actions. She wished she could explain that all she had wanted to do was help, but she knew it wouldn't be easy to make everyone understand. As the evening wore on, a knock came at the door again. This time, it wasn't the police. It was Mr. Hernandez, holding a paper bag filled with food. "If you hear from him again," he said, "let him know not everyone is afraid." Jenna smiled warmly, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Thank you." Despite the skepticism, there were still people in the neighborhood who understood the power of kindness. And for Sophie, that small gesture, a simple sandwich, had sparked something much bigger than she could have ever imagined. The knock came late in the evening, just as the Parker family was settling down for the night. The house was quiet, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the room. Sophie had just finished her homework and was curled up on the couch with her notebook, sketching as she often did. Her parents were finishing dinner, the sound of silverware clinking on plates blending with the soft hum of a TV in the background. It had been a long day, and everything felt calm, almost normal again. But then came that unexpected knock, echoing through the stillness of the house. Sophie looked up, her pencil pausing mid-drawing as her parents exchanged a glance. Mark stood up from his chair, setting his coffee cup down with a soft thud. Jenna, too, stood, her hands brushing the flour off her apron as she moved toward the door. Who could that be at this hour? Jenna murmured, her voice laced with curiosity. Mark shrugged, his brow furrowed slightly as he walked toward the front door. Sophie, feeling a quiet stirring of anticipation in her chest, followed her parents to the doorway. The moment Mark opened the door, Sophie saw two figures standing on the porch, bathed in the dim light from inside the house. A woman, her hair streaked with silver, and beside her, the man who had been sitting alone on the park bench. It was Samuel Grayson. Sophie's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the man from the park. His face had softened since she last saw him, and there was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. But it was the woman beside him that caught Sophie's attention. "I'm Clara," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm Samuel's wife. I had to come here and thank you." Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, and tears glistened in her eyes. "If it weren't for your daughter, I don't know if we would ever have found him." Samuel stepped forward, his face lined with the wear of his journey, but his expression was one of deep gratitude. "I'm not great with words," he said, his voice rough but sincere. "But I remember you, Sophie. You gave me something when I had nothing." Sophie blinked, her throat tight as she looked up at Samuel. He was standing taller now, supported by his wife, but there was still a weariness in his eyes, perhaps from more than just the physical journey he had been on. Sophie felt a strange mix of emotions as she stepped forward, unsure of what to say. All she had done was give him a sandwich. It seemed so small now, in the face of this reunion. But then, Sophie reached for her notebook. She had been working on a drawing earlier that day, a simple sketch of the park bench where Samuel had sat. She turned the pages and carefully handed the drawing to Samuel. "I drew this for you," she said softly, her voice shy and tentative. Samuel stared at the drawing for a moment, his eyes brimming with emotion as he wiped away a tear. "It's perfect," he whispered, his voice catching in his throat. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Thank you, Sophie. You gave me more than food. You gave me a reason to believe I could make it home." Clara, Samuel's wife, stepped forward then, her face softening as she looked at Sophie. She placed a hand over her heart, her voice trembling as she spoke. "You gave him more than we could have ever asked for. You gave us our family back." Her arms enveloped Sophie in a warm, tight hug. "Thank you. You don't know what this means." The emotion in the room was overwhelming. Mark and Jenna watched, their eyes glistening with unshed tears as they stood back, witnessing the profound impact of their daughter's simple kindness. Sophie, caught in the whirlwind of the moment, didn't fully understand what had just happened. All she had done was share her lunch with a man who seemed like he needed it. But now, in the presence of Samuel and Clara, Sophie realized that sometimes even the smallest act could mean the world to someone else. The family stayed for hours, talking, reminiscing, and sharing stories of Samuel's time in the army and his struggles after returning home. Samuel had served in the military for over a decade, but after his service, things hadn't been easy. He had battled with memory lapses and untreated trauma, and it had been a long and difficult road to recovery. The stress of these experiences had led him to lose track of who he was and where he belonged. For a time, he had been lost, adrift, without a sense of home or family. But thanks to Sophie's unassuming kindness, he was now on a path back to his loved ones. As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, and laughter filled the room, mingling with the quiet sobs of relief from Clara. At some point, Samuel stood and pulled something from his coat pocket, a small, weathered piece of paper. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice steady but emotional. It was a picture of his daughter, a young girl with a bright smile, who had been searching for her father just as tirelessly as Clara had. "She's been waiting for me," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "She's been waiting for me to come home." Sophie looked at the picture, then at Samuel, her eyes full of understanding. She didn't fully grasp all the intricacies of what had happened, but she knew one thing for certain. Kindness had brought this family back together. As they prepared to leave, Clara gave Sophie another tight hug. "You've shown us what real kindness is," she whispered in her ear. "Thank you." Samuel knelt down to Sophie's level, looking at her with a quiet intensity. "Thank you," he repeated, his voice steady and full of sincerity. "For me, for my family. What you did means more than you'll ever know." The door closed softly behind them, and the Parker family stood together in the living room, taking in the weight of the evening. Everything had changed. What had started as a simple lunch shared with a stranger had grown into something much bigger than Sophie could have imagined. It had healed wounds, reconnected a family, and restored hope in ways words couldn't fully describe. Sophie snuggled up next to her mom on the couch, resting her head on her shoulder as they sat in silence. It had been a long day, and Sophie felt the quiet settle around them, peaceful and comforting. "I didn't think it was a big deal," Sophie whispered. "I just gave him my lunch." Jenna smiled, her heart swelling with pride as she kissed Sophie's head. "Sometimes the smallest things mean the most." "You've reminded us all of that, Sophie." Mark nodded, his voice soft but filled with meaning. "What you did, Sophie, is something we could all learn from. It's easy to forget, in the rush of our everyday lives, that kindness doesn't cost anything. But it has the power to change lives in ways we can't always see." Sophie smiled quietly, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She didn't need to seek recognition or praise for what she had done. She was just happy that Samuel had found his way home. In the weeks that followed, Samuel's story of reunion with his family spread throughout the community. The neighbors who had once doubted Sophie's actions began to see the impact of her kindness. Many reached out, offering help to other homeless individuals in the area, inspired by the girl who had made a difference with nothing more than a sandwich and a compassionate heart. For Sophie, life returned to its familiar rhythm. She kept drawing, kept going to school, and kept being the kind of person who looked for opportunities to help others. But deep down, she knew that she had done something extraordinary, something that had changed not only Samuel's life but the lives of everyone around her. And she would carry that lesson with her always. The lesson that kindness, no matter how small, could be the spark that sets off a chain of events capable of changing the world.